Welcome, everyone. And today I have Paul McLellan on, and he's got the substack EDA Graffiti, and he's a lot like me in that he talks on a fair number of different issues, but his expertise is chips, and that's what we're going to go into. But I like a fellow blogger who is happy to go around and look intelligently at a number of different things. So we have this interesting bit of little news out of China with DeepSeek. What do you think that means for the AI chips?
Well, I think there seems to be two theories if you look on X, Twitter. One is that people will need fewer GPUs because everything's going to get so much more efficient and therefore you should sell NVIDIA now. And the other is that AI is going to become so cheap that every startup, every group in computer science in every university is all going to want lots of GPUs, and so the demand is going to increase. I don't really have a good feel for which of those is likely to be true.
Yeah, there's that thing called, what is it? I always want to call it the Jacobian whatever, but it's actually Genova or whatever, where a good example is as airline flights got cheaper, the number of airline flights taken just, skyrocketed.
Right. So that's one of the theories. I mean, in the short term, it seems to me that potentially there's a lot of stranded assets in the big hyperscalers who have invested billions of dollars in GPUs that they may not be able to make that much use of. On the other hand, they may have so many customers using these GPUs for inference that they're making money hand over fist and they need more GPUs. I think, this has only happened in like literally the last 2 or 3 days, so
Yeah,
it's a little difficult to
it'll
sort
take
of
time to
have a
settle out.
perspective on
Yeah.
it.
I think it's going to be like the dot-com crash hit, and everybody said we had way too much fiber laid out there. And 5 years later, the problem was we did not have enough fiber out there. So,
Yeah, but it took quite a long time
yeah,
before, in the meantime, WorldCom went bankrupt and somebody, Google
yeah,
bought all their fiber and kept it dark for years. And, now we don't have enough.
yeah. It's interesting how it goes along. All right, so explain why ASML is the key to semiconductors.
Well, they're the only company that builds EUV scanners. So the most advanced processes used, by which I mean the second generation of 7 nanometer, 5 nanometer, 3 nanometer, 2 nanometer, they all use EUV for some of the layers, the highest resolution layers. And there's only one company in the world that makes that. And the alternative, which is what, say, TSMC did for their first 7 nanometer, and SMIC seems to be doing in China, since they seem to be able to build 7 nanometer chips, is to use multiple patterning and using DUV. And the problem with that is it's much more expensive. It's difficult to get it to yield. Of course, if you're SMIC, you probably don't care whether it yields that much. That's probably being subsidized by the government or Huawei or some quasi-government entity. But they're the only company that makes it, and it's most unlikely, since it took them 20 years to build it and it was 10 years late, it seems most unlikely that somebody's going to suddenly turn around and be able to copy it. It's literally one of the most complex pieces of equipment that's ever been built.
I would say the most complex. And there's all their subcontractors that do incredibly
Yeah,
hard
in
stuff.
particular Zeiss, who make all the mirrors, and they're working now on high NA EUV, which has even bigger mirrors and is an even bigger machine.
So this brings up the interesting question, especially with DeepSeek just being released, is it's why it's so important that we keep China behind us on semiconductors. But China, in one sense, got some of our semiconductors, but on the other sense, what they showed is if you have slower semiconductors and less memory, you just write more efficient code. And does that mean that trying to keep China behind us in AI via limiting chips is a fool's errand, or can we still
I
make this
don't
work?
know. I mean, I'm a believer in the way to compete is to run faster rather than to try and hobble the other competitors. Plus, China seems to always find a way around these things somehow. I read somewhere recently that some huge percentage of NVIDIA's GPU sales are to Singapore. there seems to be no particular reason that there would be very many of them used in Singapore, so it's almost certainly leaking into China somehow.
Yeah, you don't hear of Singapore announcing any great AI data centers.
Right. I mean, they do have data centers in Singapore, but
Yeah, not to that level. Now, what about legacy semiconductor production? Is that something that you think China will own, or do we and the rest of the first world have a shot at hanging on to some of that?
I think if you look at all of the fabs that China's building for legacy semiconductor, and I don't think there are any particular technical challenges for them to build it. It's not like trying to build 2 nanometer or something where you could argue even if they succeed, it'll take them 10 years. So I think there's a good chance that they will dominate in that space, but it's also fast growing, especially for automotive. Not particularly because the world is selling more and more cars, but more because the electronic content in each vehicle is going up and up, especially as we move to EVs from internal combustion engines. But even internal combustion engine cars have an increasing semiconductor content for infotainment, for ADAS, and so forth. And so that seems to be one of the big markets for legacy semiconductors. They're not generally using 2 nanometer chips or whatever.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but we're not doing squat to help out the legacy producers, and China, by definition, is. So
well, we are doing a bit, right? Global Foundries is all legacy semiconductor. I mean, Not really legacy. It depends what you define legacy as, but a good definition is pre-FinFET, right? So that means greater than 16 nanometer.
And they've gotten chips money?
Global Foundries has some chips money, yeah.
Oh, okay, good.
And I think there are probably some other places, right? Because the Department of Defense, and just the defense industry in general, that's pretty much all legacy semiconductor too. I mean, it takes them so long to design anything, it's legacy, but even if they start on a leading edge node, it's legacy by the time they go into production.
Yeah, unfortunately. All right, so what about Intel? Do you think they have a future?
I don't know. When Pat Gelsinger was CEO, I thought they definitely had a future. It's interesting, I think there's a split between what's important for the US, which is the foundry part, the ability to build advanced node semiconductors on US soil, and what's important for Intel as a company, which is, to make money. And to a certain extent, the US government doesn't care if Intel sells lots of microprocessors or not, but Intel certainly does. But it seems to me that putting all your eggs in the x86 basket when it's basically a mature product where it's not in its fast-growing phase of the S-curve, PCs are not going to suddenly go up in X again or anything. And in the server space, Intel is, I wouldn't necessarily say losing, but it's certainly losing some share to AMD.
Yeah. So what happens to the U.S., if anything, if Intel goes under? Because, as you said, we do still have AMD, we still have Micron, and we got TSMC with foundries over here now. Right.
I think it's likely that Intel will in some way be split into a foundry business and the microprocessor business, and one part of it may be essentially owned by existing Intel shareholders, and private equity or somebody will take over the other half. And I hope that, or conceivably, the US government invests partially in the foundry part, which is the part that they're most concerned about. The US government and the US military really wants to have US sources for advanced node semiconductors. They use a lot of FPGAs, and they'd like to build them in the US, although they're not really so sensitive because they're kind of generic. If you build them if you build them at TSMC, they're just generic parts that don't become anything special until you program them. So it's not so sensitive, but for sure the US government would rather all of these things were built on US soil, and there's no opportunity for something nefarious to get slipped in without anybody noticing.
Yeah, because even on an FPGA, they could slip in, say, a kill switch. They can't change the logic you program in, but they probably at least could hide something and just turn it off.
Yeah, maybe if all you have is layout, it's really pretty difficult to make much of a change to it. But yeah, a kill switch is pretty simple. That may be possible, but to make major changes to read out all of the code or something, I think would be pretty much impossible.
All right. Final question for you. What's your opinion of the CHIPS Act? Has it been worth it? Is it working?
Well, it's kind of hard to say because a lot of the things that the CHIPS Act money has gone to were things that were already in flight, right? TSMC was already building a fab in Arizona, which is now operational. Samsung was already building a second fab in Texas. Intel was already had fabs and was building more. So, in one sense, most of the money has not come from the CHIPS Act, it's come from those companies themselves. TSMC got given some CHIPS Act money, I forget how much, but it was nowhere near the cost of the fabs that they're building. Same for Intel. So in the sense that it's kick-started onshore semiconductor or has helped enable that, I think you could say it's a success. I've not really looked. There's other parts to the CHIPS Act than just giving a few $1 billion to some fab companies. So I haven't really looked at all of those other parts in any great detail, but some of that funds R&D and funds some advanced packaging stuff, some of which is, at least Intel has advanced packaging and presumably will continue to do so.
All right, so before we close off, any final thoughts for everybody on chips?
So I think one of the things that's a bit of a paradox with the CHIPS Act is $50 billion, which to any other part of the US government is like, that's a huge amount of money, right? You can buy, I think it's 3 aircraft carriers, 3 of the latest generation of aircraft carriers for $50 billion. But in terms of a fab, a modern fabs, depending on capacity and process generation, is the numbers I read are sort of 25 billion, 30 billion, right? So in terms of a fab, you get maybe 2 fabs for that, but you get 3 aircraft carriers.
Now, that is a great way of putting it. A fab is 1.5 aircraft carrier.
Yeah, I looked up the price the other day to see, because I was wondering, so how much is an aircraft carrier? Because I was writing a piece, I wanted to know how a fab compared to an aircraft carrier, and was surprised to discover an aircraft carrier. I think it said the latest Ford class aircraft carrier is $13 billion.
And granted, we do need both, but...
Yeah. But aircraft carriers seem cheap when you look at the cost of a fab. I don't think you get the planes for that. I think you have to pay extra for those. But I think that's just the ship.
Well, thank you very, very much. And again, everybody, it's EDA Graffiti. And I love his blog because it's not just chips. And you go some very interesting places. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome.